the beginning of my automotive career basically started doing drawings when I was actually in the 3rd grade. And I'd actually got skipped from kindergarten to the 3rd grade. And it was kind of a disservice to me because I was always the smallest guy in class. And so now I'd kind of been the king of kindergarten because I'd been in there, 2 semesters. And because I started actually before I was 4. And then, so in the 3rd grade, we had a program to do a mural. And they put together teams. And of course, I was a team leader. And we did a 12-foot mural on kind of a white, real heavy butcher paper that I'd got from the wholesale flower market. And I drew the whole thing out, and then all the kids painted by the numbers. And then, of course, I signed it, and all the kids signed it. And we got some special award, and it went into the LA County Art Museum. And, it's a pretty proud achievement, but because there were cars, people, animals, there were greenhouses. It was kind of a pictorial of my family's nursery business. So, and all through high school, I was, drawing cars, and then I started doing the program covers for one of the timing associations. It was called Rosetta Timing Association. And they ran coupes, roadsters, streamliners. They ran everything, whereas the little more prestigious group was called the Southern California Timing Association. And they ran just strictly hot rods and leg stirrers and streamliners, no coupes or sedans. Now, they had an artist that did their program covers, and I could never figure out how he got his wheels so nice, because I was using coffee can lids and a little bit of everything in French curves. And suddenly when I started design school at Art Center, I found out the guy had been cheating all these times because he had a thing called ellipse guides that you could had all the different degree angles of, and he was using those to do his wheels. And it really upset me that I hadn't known about those. But I also started building some cars. The first one was a 29 Roadster. And we ran it at, at the El Mirage Dry Lakes and some drag racing. And then I went into a circle track racing in 1946. The end of 46, it was an organization called CRA. And I was one of the youngest car owners. So I had to have affidavits signed every race so they let me in the pits because I was actually a car owner. And they finally gave me an annual pass. And I'd quit school. In California, you have to go to school at least until you're 18. So we had a thing called the 4-4 program. You went to school 1 day a week, and then you would work, and they'd give you credits. Well, when you're racing, Mondays was always a bad day because you're coming home from a race or you're too tired, and I missed most of the classes. So they finally caught up with me, and they forced me to go back to school, so I had to give up the race car. And then the Korean War came along, and I went to Korea with the Air National Guard. And I met a whole bunch of people that were all students at Art Center College of Design. And they all told me, you ought to come to Art Center. You're good enough, we've seen your drawings and what have you. So I finally applied, and I went to school for, I believe it was 5 semesters. And somehow or other I got into a little confrontation with one of the teachers. Unfortunately, she happened to be the wife of the head of the school, so they booted me out. And the head of the school, his name was Tink Adams. And he says, Larry, we know you weren't really set up to be a car designer. So why don't you just go back to Douglas and do your normal job, and please don't give the school a bad name. And 2 months later, Ford came out to interview students, and one of my instructors invited me in. So I brought in work, and one of the drawings was a big drawing of a race car. It was done for a car owner named Bob Estes. He was a large Lincoln Mercury dealer, and it was hanging over his fireplace in a real kind of a golden framework. And he says, you can borrow it, but you can't take it out of the frame. It's got to come back in the same condition. So I had it all wrapped up in brown paper in a towel. I showed it, plus another rendering of a sprint car that was owned by a race driver named Bob Swikert. And then I had other drawings and a bunch of sketches. And the Ford people interviewed me. They kind of made some comment about the gold frame, but they liked the car. And so then they started making me offers. First they offered me $250 a month. And I knew they were paying the graduating students $4.25. So I kept telling them no. And they would slide these 3x5 cards across the table with a figure on it. And I would slide it back, say no. And the guy from the school sitting at the end of the table, and every time they had slide a card, he'd go like this, and I'd go like this. And finally he said, well, what do you want? And I made a speech. It was to a fellow named Gene Bourdonnais, who was later vice president of Ford. And he said, you're kind of a hotshot. We like your work, but what do you want from us? I said, well, I'd like to have you pay me $400 a month. I know you're paying the graduates $4.25, and try me out for 6 months. So I said, what do you want? And I told him, I says, I think I would accept $400 a month. And at the end of 6 months, if I'm doing the job for you properly, then you'll pay me $500 a month. And if I'm not, then I'll pay my own way home. And they said, so they had a little conference between themselves, Bourdonnais and the personnel fellow that was with him. And they said, okay, that's agreeable. And so then I whipped out a job contract that was done on yellow typing paper, handwritten. But it was all correct. A good friend of mine, a Jewish fella, his father had drafted it all out for me. And they were shocked that the audacity of this guy to give him a job contract or ask for one. So they finally honored it. They both signed it. And they asked for copies. So I says, how many you want? And he says, well, 2 copies. So I says, 20 cents. The copy machine was, I think it was 10 cents a copy back in those days. So that really kind of upset them, but they forked out the 20 cents. That was, I believe, in October, November of 1954. And I started work January 4th at Ford, 1955. I went to work at Ford. I worked on some cars that I'm probably not too proud of, the 58 Lincoln and the Turnpike Cruiser. And then at the end of 6 months, I got my raise. And I'd been there not quite a year, and I got an offer from Packard, $200 more a month to go to work for them. So I went up and I talked to the vice president at the time, was a fellow named George Walker. He says, Larry, we want to keep you. Would you want to stay if we match it? I said, sure. So he says, considered it done. About 3 days later, he came down to talk to me, to tell me he couldn't do it. Company policy said a person couldn't have that big a raise in that short a time. So he wished me well, and I left and went to Packard. So I was at Packard total of 7 months. We worked real hard, long hours for the first month and a half. And we finished up a car called the Clipper There was going to be a 57 model. And the clay model was shipped out to the tool shop. And the tool shop sent the models back saying they needed cash payment in advance. So that was kind of the handwriting on the wall. So so they said, you can go to work at Studebaker, or you can just sit on your heels and or go down and work on Bill Schmidt's boat. He was the vice president of design. So I said, well, I'm going to go to Indianapolis. So you can send my checks to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway to my attention. So they did. Every other Tuesday I received a check and went racing, which included the Indy 500. The car I did the design work on, Pat Flaherty's car, actually won the race, and I was on the crew. So that was in my portfolio when I went to interview for a job at General Motors. General Motors weren't very nice. They let me sit in their personnel lobby for 3 days in a row. And the first day I was there for almost 9 hours. Then they came out at closing time and told me that, they couldn't see me that day, come back tomorrow. Of course, I had read every bit of information all about their medical benefits and everything else, and every piece of literature I could find in the personnel office. So the next day I brought in magazines and a sketch pad in my lunch. And they came out and told me again they couldn't see me. And the third day, they came out around 1 o'clock and told me that the answer is no, your work's not good enough. So I asked them who'd looked at my portfolio, and they said, well, why do you need to know that? And I said, well, I'd like to know. He said, well, Mr. Andrade looked at your portfolio. So I got home. The next morning, I called, talked to his secretary. She said, well, she would check with him. She called me back and says, no, Mr. Andrade did not look at your portfolio, but he's very interested, and could you please bring it back in? So the next day I went back in with my portfolio, and they opened it up, and here's the winning cruise shot at Indianapolis, and the next page there's some sketches of the race car and aluminum or magnesium body panels being formed, and a couple of shots of the race. And then the next page there were some Packard sketches and some Lincoln stuff. Closed the portfolio and said, just a minute, I'll be right back. And he left, came back in about 20 minutes. Here this big tall man, Harley Earl. He was really, it was really kind of just amazing because he looked like he was 7 feet tall, but he was actually 6'5", I believe, but he had a very small head, so it made his body look even larger. And he looked at the portfolio, and he couldn't say Shinoda, and so he called me Larry fella. And he looked as far as the Indy car and turned the page, and then he closed the portfolio and says, Jules, why didn't you tell me we had a world famous Indy car designer here? And he says, Larry fella, how much more money do you need to come to work for us? So I computed another $200 a month more than I'd been making at Packard, and he rounded it off to almost $400 a month more. And I went to work for him September 15th of 1956. And it happened to be the same day that John DeLorean went to Pontiac. He also left Packard. So here I'm at General Motors, and the first studio is Chevrolet studio. And, well, actually it was an orientation studio, and I did a Chevrolet car that had the big kind of wings and the fin down the side, and it had the wraparound windshield, and the grille was similar to what they came out with. And it was a sketch done on red paper. And there was a front view and a rear view. rear three-quarter. And I finished them up on a Thursday, and they were hanging on the wall. Came in the next Monday, and they were gone. And my boss came over and says, well, Larry, you pack up your tabaret, you're being transferred to Chevrolet Studio. So I went to Chevrolet Studio, and here they have the two drawings on easels by a model, and they're modeling the car. It really startled me. And, they made a lot of changes before production, but the rear was just a big V shape with round lights. And then they went to that kind of a bird shape with the teardrop-shaped lights. Was one of the only major differences. And the grille was not quite as ornate as I had done. But so from that drawing, the next thing, I'd met Bunky Knudsen at Daytona Beach in '56. For the Daytona race they ran on the beach. And I'd been working with John Zink on his Indy car that won the 500, plus he had a Pontiac stock car that he had entered for Daytona. And we'd done a lot of work on it. And it turned out to be faster than the factory cars. And so Knudsen came over to Zink's garage with all the Pontiac engineers and wanted to know how do you dumb Okies make a car go so fast? And this Jack Zink says, ask old Buddha over here. That was his nickname for me. And Knudsen came over and says, what do you know about this? I said, well, it's just common sense. We lowered the nose, raised the back, and he said, why are you running a two-door? Why don't you run on a two-door hardtop? They have less frontal area. I said, yeah, maybe less frontal area, but they're quite a bit heavier than this coupe. He said, well, how much lighter do you think that is? I says, you probably won't believe it. He said, what do you mean I won't believe it? I says, well, we're 670 pounds lighter than that hardtop because there was no X-frame under it. And he didn't know that we had actually had the body acid dipped. In the hood, front fenders were really flimsy. Even the bumpers had been acid dipped. And they were just painted silver, they weren't chrome. And it only had one bucket seat, the driver's seat. It was an aircraft bucket seat. No back seats, it was really stripped down. So they transferred me to Pontiac, and I worked on the Pontiacs. And that was about a year. And then I got called down to a special studio. And, Bill Mitchell knew who I was. And we started work on the first original Stingray sports race car. It had been, initial design was done by a fellow named Chuck Pullman and Peter Brock, who did the Daytona, the Shelby Daytona coupe, the Cobras. And so from that studio was the basis for the '63 Corvette. So when we got ready to do the production car, the final design, I was in a studio underneath the lobby, in the styling lobby. It was a small studio. And we did just about 100% of the '63 Corvette in that studio. I was the only designer reporting directly to Bill Mitchell. And we had a studio engineer, an assistant, a draftsman, and two clay modelers. And we did basically the whole '63, the fastback, split window, and the convertible. We finished those up, and they were board of directors models. And then they turned those models over to the production studio, and they did the final production. Well, of all the Corvettes, I guess the '63 Corvette is probably one of my prouder jobs. Actually, one of my proudest moments in General Motors was designing a little car called the Monza GT. It was a real slick little silver coupe. And on that car, I designed every line on the car. Bill Mitchell probably would argue about that, but I did the car, you know. I did it for him, but I did the car. And it was done in such rapid time that it was the least expensive show car ever done in the history of General Motors at that time. The total cost on the vehicle was $98,000 versus the Mako Shark 2, which I designed. The total cost on it was $3,600,000. So just to give you a little scale. My designs were limited by a lot of production constraints. Engineers didn't want to have hidden headlights. They didn't want to have a rear hatch. You know, there was a whole bunch of things they didn't want to do. And we got our way in, and the car ended up with all these items. The radiator, you know, exhaust outlets on top of the hood were supposed to be functional, and they ended up being fake. We still call them foot scrapers. And then the other thing was Ed Cole had a brilliant idea to do a four-passenger. You know, so they stretched the car out, and it kind of looked like, you know, a two-hump camel. And they were really pushing it, because the Ford had the Thunderbird, had gone into a kind of a luxury four-passenger car. Yeah, they had the model all finished, and Jack Gordon was the president of General Motors. And he came in one day in his double-breasted suit and everything, and he's looking at it. And he says, Ed, tell me, can a human really sit in that back seat? He says, of course, Mr. Gordon. And he yanked open the door and tilted the seat forward. And Mr. Gordon climbed in, sat down, and was kind of hunched over in the back. Finally, and then he says, let me out of this thing. For some reason, the damn seat jammed up. And they couldn't get the seat. They had to unbolt the seat. And he's fuming because, you know, it's all union, you know, and the union mechanics had to come and unbolt the seat. And when he finally got out of the car, he was totally frustrated. And he was madder than hell. And that killed the car, which was kind of good for Corvette fans. The Z28 Camaro, it was basically all done by, you know, in the Henry Haga studio, which was Chevrolet Studio 2. They did the production Corvette and the Camaros, and also the Chevy 2 and Nova. Well, the car was started in there. The Z28 race car model, I worked on a bootleg basis with Vince Piggins, who was the product promotion chief at Chevrolet. And so we'd do models, we'd do little things. We helped do the stripe package and the front spoilers and rear spoilers for the car. And actually, I was a little bit responsible, along with Vince, for the name Z28, because it was actually an option number, which was Z28. And I coined the phrase and got $1 for it. When they ask what the Z stands for, tell them ZAP. And that was actually used in some ad copy. But, you know, that's the General Motors way, where they would pay you one crisp new dollar bill and you'd sign a release. Whereas when I went to Ford, you signed the release and then they never gave you the dollar. When the '69 model was done, there was a design contest to do the fresh air hood. And Henry Haga's studio did about 7 different designs. And they had all 7 designs sitting on workbenches in the Chevrolet wood shop. And these were all clay models. The hood I did was in fiberglass. And it was sitting not on display, but leaning against the wall right next to all these gussied up ones on the workbenches. And Pete Estes was a general manager. He came in and looked at them. He says, you know, I don't like any of these. None of these look, you know, meaningful. hey, what's that one over there? And Vince says, oh, that's one that Larry did. Well, let's see it. So they dusted it off and put it on the workbench. We actually artificially put sawdust all over it, so it looked like it had been sitting there a while. And he says, Jesus Christ, I like this one. Let's do it. And so this Henry Haga really was very upset, but they used my design on the fresh air hood. In 1967, I received an offer from Toyota to start a design studio for them. And we were in negotiations, and I talked to Knudsen, and he told me to hang on, not to do anything. So you don't want to go to work for Toyota. He says, I've got something planned that will include you. Well, what that plan was going to Ford as a president. And so I was supposed to start work 2 weeks after he started. But Bourdonnais, the guy that hired me originally, he was now the vice president, and he fought it tooth and nail. So it took almost 3 months before I got to Ford. And I got to Ford actually three pay levels lower than I was supposed to be. In fact, they'd hired another fella in that defect from GM that wasn't really a designer, and he took my position that I was supposed to have had. So I got there, a lower pay grade, so I had to prove myself. And in the first 7 months, I won hell for bent, and we did. At that time, we did the Boss 302. They were gonna call the Boss 302 the SR2, standing for Sedan Racing Category 2, which was kind of a dumb name because there had already been a whole series of Corvettes called SR2 Corvettes. And I think there were 3 models built. And so I fought it, and I just thought Boss would be a much better name, and that was kind of the name how I referred to Knudsen. He was always the boss. And I even had badges made up that said, think Boss, and it had a Ford oval, and passed those out, campaigned the name. The fellow that handled all the itineraries for Mr. Ford, he didn't like the name. So it never went on the list. So the big meeting for the name was going to be held on, I believe it was December 9th. So on December 7th, I sent him a telegram. His name was Chalmers Goyard. The telegram says, Dear Chalmers, please don't look up towards the sun this morning. You may be hit by a flying object. And then it said, think Boss. And it was signed the Rising Sun. He got so upset that he drove all the way over to Grosse Pointe and went and beat on Mr. Ford's door. And luckily, Edsel was home for Christmas leave from Babson University. He answered the door and says, oh, Chalmers, what brings you over here? He says, well, I got this letter. I got this telegram. He says, I need to talk to your father. So I invited him in, and Mr. Ford was having a coffee royale in his study. He says, come on in, Chalmers. What brings you over here? He says, I've got this letter. This so-and-so sent me this telegram. And so he says, well, which so-and-so? He says, well, that Japanese fellow the Knudsen brought over here. Says, well, let me look at it. So he put his glasses on, he looked at it, he says, oh, that's a pretty good name, Chalmers. That's kind of like the name on the building. And, poured him a coffee royale and wished him well and sent him home. So Monday morning, here's the big blue letter meeting. And everybody's there in the executive conference room on I think it was the 14th floor. Mr. Ford came in and everybody stood up, and then everybody sat down, and Mr. Goyard put the list in front of him, the blue letter for him to sign off on. And he looked at it and he says, Chalmers, where's that name we talked about? He said, I didn't think it was appropriate, Mr. Ford. So Mr. Ford wrote in Boss 302 HF2. That was it. So the first thing that happens, Knudsen was there, and he called, "What the hell did you do?" He says, "Oh, I sent Chalmers a telegram." "What did it say?" So I told him what it said, and he says, "Oh, Jesus Christ, you're trying to get us all fired?" And I said, "Well, it worked, didn't it?" He said, "Well, yeah." So, I not only put the name on the car, but I actually took care of handling the options and all the other things that went into the vehicle. We turned the Boss 302 program into a product improvement project. So that, and they're saying, "Well, how can that possibly be a product improvement?" I said, "Well, and also profit improvement." So I removed a whole bunch of superfluous stuff that was on the car. The fake air scoops are on the side, comprised of 5 parts on each side, and they had to be all painted separately. The back, they were going to have a great big die-cast grill across the back, and a big fake gas cap, and these big castings for the exhaust outlets. They were even going to have a big die-cast aluminum piece that went down the side that said SR2. And they had floor grids. They were metal with the rubber coming through, and they said SR2. They had a big metal emblem that went in the seat back that was sunk in, but when you sat in the seat, you could still feel this metal piece hit you in the back, and that said SR2. And they had some big, phony-looking hood pins that were, they were functional, but they just were really heavy-looking. And they had real narrow, skinny wheels. I put 7-inch wheels on, took all this superfluous stuff off. We did this little C-stripe, but it was decal, not paint, and the hood was painted. And then I did the options for the sport slats, the louvered back window, and the rear spoiler that bolted on, and the front air dam. And then the engine they wanted to use was a tunnel port 302 that didn't have the torque curve that the final Boss 302 had. And we patterned the Boss 302 torque curve more like the Z28 Camaro. And it actually put out more horsepower than the Z28. And but it wasn't really until 1970 that the car won the championship. And that was after I'd left Ford. But yeah, Knudsen was there 19 months, and I was there 16 months. And it happened at the Frankfurt Auto Show. Knudsen was fired the Friday of the Frankfurt Auto Show, and I was in Frankfurt. And Walter Hayes was one of the managing directors of Ford of Europe and the head PR person. He captured me at the hotel in Frankfurt, took me up to my room, and told me that Knudsen had been fired. And he called Bourdonnais from the room, and after he poured me a drink. And we talked to Bourdonnais, and Bourdonnais told me, nothing to worry about, just go about your job in Italy, because I was going there to do some work for Iacocca on a car called the Pantera. And I'll see you when you get back. So 2 weeks later, I got home, and that Monday morning, he fired me. Like the old adage, form follows function. Well, I really believe in that. And in the case of the Stingray, the Z28, and the Boss 302, it was form follow function, but I didn't have a chance to design the form for the Mustang, and I didn't have the chance to design the form for the Z28, but I did have a chance to design the embellishments that help make the car stand out. Whereas the Boss 302, it's become one of the real treasured Mustangs of the whole Mustang collection. And it's sure, some people could say, well, it's just lipstick on a pig, but in some form, I guess I'd have to say that's true. It's just like on this this Boss package here. That's a package I'm doing, and it's when I saw the car, I thought, well, it needs a little excitement. We did the stripe package, and it's been fairly well accepted. Now we're also looking at doing a model called the Boss Cobra, which is their new 4.6 car. But on this car, it'll say Boss Cobra. It won't say Shinoda. So maybe that'll ease the pain a little bit. But there will be a Shinoda design sticker that'll go on the car on either side and on the rear and on the glove compartment. We're working with a dealer group from Nassau, New Hampshire, and he's drop shipping us a car, and we're going to do a complete job on it and then ship it back to him. And it'll be a Boss Cobra.